Winter in Finland does not arrive. It descends, slowly. First the birds go silent, and the rivers, and the forests, and finally the human voice. In January, the sun barely rises above the horizon. Daylight lasts only a few hours, and the night is not black, but white. Everything is white. The ground, the trees, the paths, even the borders. And that is precisely why borders there are so dangerous. Because in Finland, a border is not a line on a map. It is a space controlled by nature, not by man. But in 1939, an empire decided it could ignore nature. In Moscow, the leadership of Soviet Union made a decision. Finland had to be pushed farther away from Leningrad. The frontier was too close, too vulnerable. On paper, it was a strategic necessity. In reality, it was the beginning of a disaster. Soviet generals expected a short campaign, a few weeks, at most, a month. The numbers justified their confidence. More than 500,000 soldiers, tanks, artillery, aircraft. Opposing them? A small nation with a limited army, outdated equipment, and almost no reserves. Finland could not win a conventional war, and the Finns knew it. So they did not fight a conventional war. On November 30th, 1939, the Winter War began. Soviet units advanced along the roads. That was the first mistake. In Europe, roads are an advantage. In Karelia, they are a trap. These were not the forests of Central Europe. There were no villages, no open farmland, no long lines of sight, only endless miles of pine trees, frozen swamps, and ice-covered lakes. A column entering those forests could not maneuver. It could only stretch. And once it stretched, it became vulnerable. The Finns did not attack head-on. They cut. Small ski patrols emerged from the forest, struck sections of the column, and vanished again. Supply trucks burned. Horses panicked. Communication failed. Soviet formations began breaking into isolated pockets, later called Madi. And then the real fighting began. Not a battle between armies. A hunt. In one of those forests, near Kala, a reservist arrived. His name meant nothing beyond his village. Simo Häyhä, born in 1905. A farmer's son. No military academy training. But he possessed something more valuable. He already understood snow, not as scenery, as language. He knew how sound traveled at 20 degrees Celsius. He knew the smell of a man moving through pine forest. He knew that a crow taking flight suddenly meant presence. And he knew something soldiers from cities did not. The forest always tells you when someone is coming. His first day at the front, he did nothing. He watched. The second day, the same. The third day, he fired. One shot. No one knew from where. A Soviet soldier fell. The others dropped into the snow. But there was no enemy. Only forest. And silence. The next day, the same. And the next. Something strange began to happen. Soviet patrols stopped moving freely. They began moving at night. Then they stopped moving even at night. Fear does not come from battle. Fear comes when you do not know where the danger is. Soon, stories spread among the troops. Of a marksman no one had seen. Of a man who left no tracks. Of a sniper who never missed. And they gave him a name. The White Death. Not because he wore white camouflage, but because he appeared like a force of nature. Like a blizzard. Like an avalanche. Something you cannot attack. Only hope will pass. And the most terrifying part, he did not kill many at once. He killed every day, slowly, methodically. And the army began to understand this was not merely a sniper. This was a man using winter itself as a weapon. War is usually noise, artillery, engines, orders shouted across trenches. But snipers fight a different war. A silent one. A sniper does not conquer territory. He conquers attention. Because once soldiers know a sniper is present, they stop thinking about the enemy army. They start thinking about death. Simo Häyhä understood this instinctively. He did not hunt men. He hunted behavior. Every morning before dawn, he left his position and skied alone into the forest. No escort, no spotter, no radio. He carried only what he needed: his rifle, ammunition, a knife, and food that would not freeze solid. He was not looking for targets. He was looking for patterns. Armies always create patterns: where they walk, where they rest, where they smoke, where officers stand longer than others. A soldier moves randomly. An army never does. And Häyhä learned their rhythm. He chose positions hours before the Soviets even appeared. Then he prepared the ground. He packed the snow tightly beneath his body so the rifle would not recoil into soft powder. He built a low snow wall in front of the muzzle to hide the blast. And then he did something almost no one else thought to do. He filled his mouth with snow. At 30 degrees Celsius, breath becomes visible instantly. A single cloud of vapor can betray a sniper hundreds of meters away. So he froze his lips, his tongue, and his teeth to erase even that sign of life. Then he waited, not for minutes, for hours, sometimes an entire day, without moving a single muscle. He did not use a telescopic sight. Most snipers depended on optics. Häyhä refused them. A scope required lifting the head slightly higher. It could reflect light. It could freeze. It narrowed the field of view. Iron sights were lower, simpler, more reliable in extreme cold. And in the forests of Kola, distance was not kilometers. It was meters, close enough for precision. The first Soviet counter-snipers arrived within days. Experienced marksmen. They studied angles, watched tree lines, waited for movement. They never saw him. Because he did not think like a soldier. He thought like prey. Animals survive by assuming they are always being hunted. So he never fired twice from the same place. After every shot, he vanished into the trees. Not quickly, but invisibly. He moved only when wind covered sound. Only when snow fell. Only when shadows broke his outline. And sometimes he did not leave at all. He simply became part of the ground. The psychological effect spread faster than the casualties. Soviet troops began to fear open spaces, then tree lines, and even their own camps. Cooking fires were extinguished early. Conversations grew quiet. Officers stopped standing upright while giving orders. Entire patrols refused to move without heavy support. An army trained for offensive maneuver had become stationary. And a stationary army in winter is a dying army. Commanders tried artillery. They shelled entire sections of forest after every suspected shot. Trees shattered. Snow exploded into white clouds. The bombardments lasted hours. When they ended, another soldier fell the next day. They increased patrol sizes. More men, more weapons. But larger groups only made clearer targets. Because he did not need to defeat them in battle. He only needed them to hesitate. And hesitation in combat is more lethal than bullets. Soon, specific orders spread through Soviet units. Find the Finnish sniper. Not a unit, not a position. A single man. Special hunter teams were formed. Skiers trained to track marksmen. They followed footprints, broken branches, compressed snow. But the tracks ended. Not because he disappeared. Because he moved backwards through his own path. And then left across frozen ground. He understood something simple. Humans look forward. Hunters look where they expect movement. So he left none. By January 1940, his presence alone could stop advances. Columns slowed. Patrols avoided certain areas entirely. Some soldiers fired blindly into forests just to feel safer. and the name spread from platoon to platoon. The White Death, not a myth anymore, a certainty. If you entered those woods, he might already be watching. He never celebrated. He never boasted. To him, this was not heroism. It was duty. He believed he was not fighting soldiers. He was protecting homes behind him. Villages, families, fields buried under snow. He was not trying to win glory. He was buying time. Time for his country to survive a war it could not win in numbers. And slowly, Soviet command realized a frightening truth. They were not facing a defensive line. They were facing an environment, guided by a man who understood it perfectly. An army was fighting winter, and winter had chosen a marksman, the Soviet panic. At first, Soviet commanders dismissed the reports. Every war produces rumors. Soldiers exaggerate. Fear invents stories. One sniper cannot stop an army. That was the assumption. Then the reports kept coming. From different sectors, different units, different officers. Always the same description. Single shots. No visible shooter, no tracks, no captured weapon, and always casualties at dawn. Frontline officers tried to explain it rationally. Perhaps several Finnish snipers were operating together. Perhaps a hidden fortified position existed in the forest. Perhaps artillery observers were guiding the shots. But the pattern did not fit. There was no coordinated fire, no multiple directions. Only one shot at a time. Precise, patient, deliberate. An entire command structure struggled to accept the simple possibility. It was one man. Within weeks, soldiers began refusing assignments into certain sectors near Kala. Patrol leaders requested reinforcements before moving even short distances. Messengers traveled, crouched through the snow. Even experienced veterans began avoiding open ground. The fear was not just death, it was unpredictability. Battle can be endured when danger is visible. Men will charge machine guns, artillery, even tanks. But an invisible threat changes behavior. A soldier who cannot see the enemy stops thinking about victory. He thinks only about survival. And an army focused on survival cannot advance. Soon, the nickname spread across entire divisions. The White Death. It appeared first in whispers, then in official reports. The Soviet command could not ignore it anymore. Because morale began to collapse, night watches doubled. Troops dug deeper trenches. Movement slowed to a crawl. And time was something the Soviet offensive did not have. The campaign had been planned as a rapid operation, a demonstration of strength. Instead, weeks passed with minimal territorial gain and mounting losses. And in several sectors, one sniper was being mentioned more often than entire Finnish units. Propaganda officers attempted to counter the fear. They told soldiers the sniper had already been killed. They reported false victories. They issued newspapers describing heroic advances. But the forest contradicted the newspapers. Each morning, another casualty. And soldiers trust what they see more than what they are told. Rumor became belief. Belief became certainty. Some troops claimed he could see through trees. Others said he moved underground between positions. Some insisted he never slept. Myths were forming, not because soldiers are foolish, but because fear demands explanation. When the human mind cannot understand danger, it gives it power. Soviet command changed strategy. If artillery could not stop him, specialists would. Dedicated counter-sniper detachments were deployed to the sector. These were not ordinary infantry. They were experienced marksmen trained to detect concealment, read terrain, and locate firing positions. They waited for days, watching likely vantage points, studying light angles, listening for mechanical sounds. They saw nothing, because Häyhä was not hiding behind fortifications. He was hiding inside normality, a small snowdrift. a shadow beneath a pine branch, a slight rise in the ground. He chose places no one would suspect, precisely because they looked unremarkable. Some teams came very close. On several occasions, Soviet snipers believed they had identified his position. They fired. Artillery followed. Entire patches of forest were destroyed. Yet the next day, another shot. Another soldier fell. The realization was worse than not finding him. They might have been aiming at him, and still failed. Commanders escalated again. Heavy machine guns were positioned to sweep tree lines continuously. Mortar were pre-aimed at suspected areas. Orders were issued. Any movement in the snow, fire immediately. But this created a new problem: exhaustion. Soldiers began firing at shadows, branches, even animals. A single sound triggered volleys of gunfire. A nervous army wastes ammunition, energy, and focus. And fatigue is a weapon. Häyhä understood patience better than any tactic. He could wait longer than an army could stay alert. By February 1940, operational reports described a peculiar situation. Entire units hesitated to advance without daylight advantage. Officers shortened reconnaissance patrols. Road movement increased because forests were considered unsafe, which was exactly the opposite of what they needed. The forests had become psychological territory, and it belonged to one man. High command finally reached a conclusion. The sniper was no longer a tactical problem. He was a strategic one, because he was changing behavior across multiple units. Orders were sent with unusual clarity. Locate and eliminate the Finnish sniper at any cost. Not for revenge, for momentum. An offensive army cannot operate while afraid to move. And so, the hunt reversed. For the first time in the war, an army began hunting a single soldier. By late February 1940, winter had reached its harshest point. Temperatures dropped so low that metal burned skin on contact. Rifle bolts froze in place. Fuel thickened inside engines. For most soldiers, survival itself had become a daily struggle. But for Simo Häyhä, the cold was no longer an obstacle. It was protection. The harsher the weather became, the fewer patrols ventured deep into the forest. Movement slowed. Sound carried farther across frozen air. And still, each day, he went out alone. Not because he was ordered to, because routine had become purpose. He no longer needed to search for targets. He understood their habits now. Morning relief patrols. Officers checking positions shortly after sunrise. Messengers crossing open ground at predictable times. He observed more than he fired. And that was what made him dangerous. A sniper who shoots often reveals himself. A sniper who waits controls the battlefield. But the Soviet command had not stopped adapting. Counter-sniper teams were still operating in the sector. Artillery units remained on alert. And now they had a clearer objective. They were no longer scanning the entire forest. They were studying one pattern, his. They analyzed previous casualties, mapped firing directions, calculated likely ranges. For weeks, nothing happened. Then, on March 6, 1940, the pattern aligned. The morning was clear. No snowfall, no wind. Perfect visibility. The kind of day most dangerous for a sniper. Häyhä took position before sunrise, as he always did. A small snowbank along a known route, a place he had used successfully before. Hours passed. The forest was quiet, too quiet. But patience had protected him many times before. And so he remained, watching, waiting. At some point that morning, another sniper was also waiting. Somewhere beyond the tree line, a Soviet marksman had been tracking the same pattern. Not hunting movement, hunting expectation. He knew a Finnish sniper favored that route. And unlike others, he did not rush. He waited for the smallest mistake. And even the most careful man is still human. The shot came without warning. Not a near miss. Not a glancing impact. A direct hit. An explosive bullet struck Häyhä in the face. The force threw him backward into the snow. His rifle fell from his hands. Blood spread across the white ground. For the first time since the war began, the forest was silent. No return fire. No movement. Nothing. Nearby Finnish soldiers later described finding him unrecognizable. Half his face destroyed, barely breathing. They believed he was already dead, but they carried him back anyway. Through trenches, across frozen ground, under artillery fire. A soldier who had fought alone was now carried by others. He fell into a coma. Days passed. The war continued around him. Offensives, shelling, negotiations. And he remained unconscious, unaware of everything he had become. On March 13, 1940, the Moscow Peace Treaty, 1940, was signed. The fighting stopped, and on that same day, Simo Häyhä opened his eyes. He had slept through the end of the war. The man and army had hunted for months, learned of peace only after it had already arrived. The sniper was alive, but the White Death had disappeared. He would never return to the battlefield, not because he refused, because war had already taken its price. His injuries required years of recovery, multiple surgeries, a lifetime of physical consequences, yet he survived, while thousands who had searched for him did not. For Soviet soldiers, confirmation spread slowly. The sniper was gone, not captured, not defeated in battle, simply removed by a single moment of chance. And with his disappearance, something else vanished. A constant hesitation. Movement resumed. Patrols advanced again, not because winter changed, but because the man who understood it was no longer there. War often ends not with a final battle, but with exhaustion. And sometimes, history turns not on grand offensives, but on one bullet fired once at the right moment. When the guns fell silent in March 1940, Finland still stood. The war had lasted only 105 days. For the world, it was a small conflict on the edge of Europe. For Finland, it was survival. The Winter War ended with territorial losses. Cities were abandoned. Families relocated westward. Fields and homes were left behind in the snow. Yet independence remained. And for a nation facing overwhelming numbers, that alone mattered. In hospitals far from the front, soldiers began returning home. Some with medals, some with scars, and one with both, though he never asked for either. Simo Häyhä awoke to a country that already knew his name. Newspapers had written about him during the war. Officers had reported his actions. Stories had traveled faster than confirmation. But he had not heard any of it. While the legend spread, the man had been unconscious. Doctors doubted he would recover fully. His injuries were severe. Reconstructive surgeries lasted years. Speaking was difficult. Eating was painful. For a long time, survival itself was uncertain. Yet he endured, not with dramatic speeches, not with public appearances, but quietly, the same way he had fought. Official tallies credited him with over 500 confirmed sniper kills. Even in war, numbers are debated, but even conservative estimates placed him among the most effective snipers in military history. More striking than the number was the context. He operated without a sniper team, without advanced optics, without modern camouflage systems, and almost always alone. Military historians later studied his methods. They found no secret weapon, no revolutionary technology, only discipline, patience beyond ordinary endurance, understanding of terrain, and control of fear. Because the defining trait of a sniper is not marksmanship, it is stillness. To remain motionless for hours in freezing temperatures requires more than skill. It requires a mind able to quiet instinct, Most people cannot defeat cold. Fewer can defeat their own movement. Häyhä did both. After recovery, he returned not to the army, but to the countryside. He became a hunter again, raised dogs, lived a rural life. He rarely spoke about the war. When asked about his accuracy, he answered simply, "I practiced." No explanation, no stories, no attempt to shape his own legend. Over time, the story grew beyond Finland. Writers documented it. Soldiers studied it. Snipers in later wars read about him as an example of fieldcraft, not because he was the most aggressive, because he was the most controlled. His actions demonstrated something unusual in military history. Technology does not always decide outcomes. Environment does. And the person who understands the environment best holds power far greater than rank. The image of the White Death changed as well. To enemies, it had been terror. To his country, it became resilience. Not a symbol of destruction, but of resistance. A small nation proving that numbers alone do not guarantee victory. That determination can compensate for disadvantage. And that sometimes, the strongest defense is not a wall, but a person who refuses to move. He lived decades after the war, long enough to see the world change, long enough to see weapons evolve far beyond anything he had used. But his story remained relevant, because modern warfare still depends on awareness, patience, and adaptation. Qualities older than any rifle. In 2002, Simo Häyhä died at the age of 96. Not on a battlefield, not in conflict, but peacefully in the same country he had defended as a young man. The forests remained. The snow still fell each winter. And somewhere in those silent landscapes, his story stayed connected to the place where it began. History often remembers generals, sometimes politicians, rarely individuals without rank or command. Yet occasionally, a single soldier alters the behavior of thousands, not by leading them, by making them stop,